Howdy year sixes, how are we doing? Well, excellent. Welcome to another problem of the week with your host, Mr. Morrissey. That's me, by the way. Now, very excitingly, in this lesson, we're going on to a new topic, or a new-ish topic, so don't get too excited on second thoughts. So we've been looking a lot at ratios, of course, and during that time, to help us understand ratios, we looked for connections between ratios and fractions. So I thought it would make sense to focus on connections, similarities and differences between fractions, decimals and percentages, and also look at how to convert between them. Sound good? Well then, let's begin. Have you ever asked yourself the question, what's the difference between fractions, decimals and percentages? You haven't? Oh. Well, why don't you ask it now? What's the difference between fractions, decimals, and percentages? Any thoughts? What's the same about them? Well, they are all kinds of fractions. So decimals and percentages are kinds of fractions, but maybe they're more limited fractions. So we know a fraction can have any whole number as a denominator, isn't that right? So a fraction can be out of 1 or 17 or 5,492. Decimals are fractions, but only with particular denominators. Their denominators might be 10 for tenths, 100 for hundredths, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million, and so on. So decimals only have denominators which are multiples of 10. Now, what about percentages? Do you know what percent means? Per, means out of kilometers per hour, kilometers out of 1 hour. And cent, you probably know from words like century or from foreign languages like French or Spanish, that cent means 100. So percent means out of 100. So a percentage is a fraction out of 100. It only has one denominator. So it's like a decimal, but a decimal only out of 100. So I hope those connections are clear because they're really, really important to help you understand each one. As ever, you can use your understanding in one aspect of maths to help you understand other aspects of maths. So fractions, decimals, and percentages are very, very closely connected. In fact, they're all kinds of fractions. We're going to think about converting between them, so writing equivalent fractions, decimals, and percentages. What can you see on the screen? It's a 100 grid. There are 100 of these small squares in the whole grid. Okay, I put a counter in one of the squares. Let's think about that. What fraction is that? I've filled in one square out of 100 in total. So that's the fraction. It's 1 out of 100. And we know a percentage is a fraction out of 100. So 1 out of 100 or 100th is 1%. So that's 1%. And what about that? It's 300s, isn't it? 3 out of 100 in total, or 3%. Now we're going to complete this table, so writing equivalent fractions, percentages, and decimals, starting with a half. Now you may well know what a half is as a percentage and as a decimal. Let's see if we can make sense of it here. So if I cover half of the whole grid, how many squares is that? I've covered 50 squares out of 100. 50 out of 100, 50%. So a half as a percentage is 50% and 50% as a fraction is a half. Now a quarter, let's cover a quarter of the whole grid. How many squares have I covered? What percentage is that? It's 25 out of 100, 25%. So a quarter as a percentage is 25%. 25% as a fraction is 1/4. Next one. 1/10. That's 1/10, isn't it? 1 row out of 10 rows in total. So as a percentage, it's It's 10 out of 100. I've covered 10 squares out of 100 squares in total, 10%. Next one is 20%. So we're converting 20%. We'll do it to a fraction. I know I've been ignoring the decimals. That's for a reason. We'll look at those in a moment. So 20%, what's 20% of the whole grid? It's 20 squares out of 100 in total. It's 2 rows. 1 row is 10, 2 rows is 20. That's 20%. What is that as a fraction? It's 2 rows out of 10 rows in total, isn't it? 2/10. Now, can we simplify 2/10? You should always ask yourself, can I simplify this fraction before you write it down as your final answer? So 2/10. Well, is there a common factor of 2 and 10? What's the highest common factor of 2 and 10? What's the highest number that divides exactly into 2 and 10? It's 2. So we'll divide top and bottom by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We get 1/5. So 20% as a fraction is 1/5. 1/5 as a percentage is 20%. Now let's look at the decimals. Now, converting between percentages and decimals is really quite straightforward. There's no real calculating that needs to be done. You just need to apply your understanding of place value. I'll show you what I mean. We've got our place value chart. Let's take 50%. What is that as a decimal? 50% is 50 out of 100. It's 50 hundredths. So 50 hundredths, how do we write that in our place value chart? Well, like this. That's how you write 50 hundredths in the place value chart. So we've got our decimal, 0.5. We don't need our 0 in the hundredths because that's worth nothing. So 0.5 and 50% and a half are all equivalent. Next one, 25%. How would you write that in the place value chart? What does 25% mean? 25 hundredths. How do we write that? 0.25. That's our decimal. And hopefully by now you can see that 10% will be 0.1 and 20% will be 0.2. And we can use a similar method to convert our decimals to percentages. 0.45. If I write it in here, I've got what? 45 hundredths, haven't I? 45 hundredths, which is 45%. What's that as a fraction? Well, 45 hundredths is a fraction. So we've got our fraction, but can we simplify it? We can. What goes into both 45 and 100? 5 does. 45 divided by 5 is 9. And 100 divided by 5 is 20. So 0.45 is 9/20ths and 45%. The last one, 0.8. I'm going to write it in the place value chart, 0.8. So what's that in hundredths? 8/10, yes, but how many hundredths? It's 80 hundredths, 80%. 80%. And as a fraction? Well, we said it was 8/10, didn't we? That's a fraction. Can we simplify it? Yes. We divide top and bottom by 2, and we get 4/5. So 0.8 is 80% and 4/5. I hope that's all clear. Now some questions for you to do. Your own table to complete. Completing these statements and spotting equivalents to 60%. 3 extra challenges for you. For the third one, you're creating fractions with these digit cards. There's no limit to the fractions you can make, but how many of those can you convert into decimals and percentages? Get ready for some answers. Here's my answers to the first 3 questions. And some possible answers to the reasoning challenges. Well, sadly, year 6s, it's time to say goodbye as we've come to the end of another problem of the week. But don't fret, we will see each other again very soon. In the meantime, look after yourself, look after your family, and stay safe. Bye!